I'm Nora Bennett, 37 years old, and the night I realized I no longer belonged anywhere was the night I ate cold soup with a plastic spoon sitting on a cot inside a 10-foot storage unit while rain ticked against the metal roof. 6 months earlier, I had a husband who kissed my forehead in the kitchen, 2 kids who left cleats and art supplies in every room, and a job that felt like my name was stitched into its seams, but that life faded faster than a photograph left in the sun. My sister said it was meant to be, my husband called it moving forward, and strangers softened their eyes like I'd misplaced something small, when in truth the loss echoed in every corner I walked through. That same night, my phone lit up with a message from Aaron that read like a verdict, and I almost believed it until a beam from my flashlight slid across a broken chair and caught the edge of a leather case with my name on its tag. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. The silence felt like snow, like whatever came next was already falling. Inside the case was not only cash I had not earned, but a short note in the shaky hand of a man I had loved and feared in equal measure as a girl. His words were brief and certain, and they pointed me toward a place far from Oregon, far from every excuse I had told myself. I would leave before dawn, though I didn't know it yet. I would follow the first solid line I'd seen in months. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to rebuild when the ground gave way under your feet, tap that like and subscribe so this story finds others who need it. I grew up in a small ranch house on the edge of Willow Creek, Oregon, a place where winter fog clung to the river and neighbors waved from pickup trucks. My father taught me to measure twice and cut once, and my mother taught me that a door should open slowly enough to make room for kindness. We didn't have much, but the floor was steady, and the rules were simple. Tell the truth, show up, share what you can, and keep your word, even when it costs you. I was the quiet one who drew porches and kitchens in the margins of my notebooks, then learned how walls carry weight and where light should fall. By the time I was 30, I'd helped Stephen Marks grow Willow Creek Design and Build from a back-office blueprint shop into a firm people trusted with their homes. My sister Kelsey followed me into the field, younger by 3 years and quicker with a smile. She started in client relations and drifted toward design, and I tried to make room for her the way my parents had made room for me. When I married Aaron Whitfield, the son of a man whose name was carved into half the loading docks in our county, I walked into a different world without meaning to. Dinners felt longer, glassware thinner, and every introduction came with a test I could not quite read. Our little 2-story had blue shutters and a swing. He bolted to the porch beams one spring afternoon, and on Sundays Mason's cleats thumped up the walk while Ella tucked her rabbit under my arm so she could tie her shoes without losing him. At the firm, I led projects that balanced budgets and daylight, while Kelsey charmed vendors and laughed with clients down the hall, and I convinced myself that busy was the same as okay. The difference between the life I came from and the one I had entered showed up in subtle places: how people paused when Aaron said his last name, how quickly meetings ended when he checked his watch, how gratitude felt like a favor rather than a habit, and I told myself it was just adjustment that I could fit both languages in my mouth. I learned to keep my calendar tight and my voice even. I told my team to go home on time and often stayed behind to finish the last set of revisions myself, liking the quiet when the office emptied and the printers cooled. Kelsey would appear in my doorway, hip against the frame, asking if I needed a hand, and I would hand her a red pen and an extra set of eyes, grateful for a sister who knew the weight of a deadline. At home, bedtime came with checklists. Uniform washed, poster board, found permission slip signed, and sometimes Aaron stood at the counter scrolling while I packed lunches, saying he'd transfer money for the field trip in the morning. He didn't always remember, but I did. When my mother called, she asked if I was eating enough and if I still carried cash in my wallet in case a card machine failed, and I would laugh and say I was fine because most days I believed it. The first hairline crack didn't look like a crack. It looked like a delay. A meeting that ran long, a dinner changed to next week, a joke at my expense that sounded like a compliment until it settled wrong a few minutes later. Aaron praised Kelsey's people sense in a way that made her grin and made me feel like the steady floor I stood on had become a rug. I told myself families have seasons, teams shift, we make room. Stephen started routing more client tours through Kelsey's calendar, and I said, good, she's ready, while a part of me I didn't like kept a quiet tally I ignored. In our house, the laughter still came, but it landed softer. I folded laundry on the couch after the kids were asleep and felt the kind of tired that doesn't go away with rest. What I didn't know yet sat 3 days ahead of me inside an email with no sender name and a subject line that would tilt the whole room. By the time I opened it, the photo inside would do its work without a single caption. The email arrived late on a Thursday afternoon, just as the office printer sputtered its last page and the low winter light began to dim across my desk. The subject line was short, "You deserve to know." At first, I thought it was spam and hovered over the delete key. But curiosity won, and when I opened the message, there was only a single attachment, a photo. My hand went still on the mouse as the image filled the screen. Aaron and Kelsey stood in the parking lot behind our building, his hand on her waist, his mouth against hers. The air left my lungs in one sharp sound I didn't recognize as my own. For a moment, I told myself it had to be a trick, some cruel edit. Then I noticed the cracked asphalt, the dumpster in the corner, the company logo reflected on the window behind them. Every detail belonged to a place I knew. I left my chair too quickly and caught the edge of the desk, knocking a coffee mug to the floor. The sound made Stephen glance up from his office across the hall, but I waved him off, pretending I was fine. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was gone, and the air smelled of rain and car exhaust. I drove home without turning on the radio, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached. When I walked through the front door, Aaron was in the kitchen scrolling through his phone like any other evening. "Aaron," I said quietly, holding up my screen. "What is this?" He looked at once, sighed, and set his phone down on the counter. "Nora, don't make a scene," he said as if we were standing in a grocery line instead of our kitchen. "You've been distant for years. Kelsey understands me." I waited for him to take it back to say something human, but he didn't. The words settled heavy between us, and the silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. The next morning I didn't sleep in. I went to work like habit would save me. But when Kelsey walked through the glass doors of the firm, her hair freshly cut and her smile practiced, she didn't look away. She set her hand on Aaron's arm when he came to meet her for lunch. Around us, people tried not to stare. That Monday, Stephen called me into his office. He didn't meet my eyes when he said the firm was moving in a different direction. Kelsey would be taking over my position. I thanked him for the opportunity, like a fool who hadn't yet learned that losing everything can happen in 3 sentences. Within weeks, the divorce papers arrived. Aaron's lawyer painted me as unstable and consumed by work, the kind of mother who missed school plays and burned dinners. Every page rewrote the life I had lived, and every signature took something else I couldn't afford to lose. The judge granted him the house and primary custody, and when the decision was read aloud, Kelsey was seated beside him, calm as a photograph. I walked out into rain that fell sideways against my umbrella, and when it flipped inside out, I didn't bother to fix it. My phone buzzed. A message from Aaron. "You'll die poor and alone. Kelsey's already a better mother to our kids than you ever were." The words didn't cut immediately. They sank slowly, heavy as stones in cold water. I drove nowhere for hours, just circled familiar streets until the gaslight blinked. That night, Mason's football photos appeared online. Aaron stood next to him, one arm raised in a fatherly cheer, while Ella smiled faintly beside Kelsey. I scrolled through the pictures until the screen blurred. When I called the house, Kelsey answered. "They're fine, Nora," she said, her tone smooth, rehearsed. "Maybe give them space." Then she hung up. The following week, my savings thinned to numbers that couldn't stretch past rent and groceries. When I stopped at the market to buy milk, my debit card declined. I stood in the aisle with the carton sweating in my hands, waiting for something grace maybe to change the moment. It didn't. I left the milk on the shelf and walked out. By the end of the month, I was sleeping in my car behind a closed diner, washing my face in the restroom before dawn. The owner, a gray-haired man named Tom, caught me one morning and said gently, "There's a place down by the highway, cheap, quiet, storage units. They don't ask questions." That's how I ended up in Unit 42B. 10 feet long, 5 wide, just enough room for a cot, a lantern, and 2 boxes of clothes. The metal walls smelled of oil and old cigarettes. I used a camping stove to heat soup and borrowed Wi-Fi from the gas station across the street. Nights blurred together, marked only by the sound of rain tapping the roof and trucks rumbling past on the highway. I kept a photo of Mason and Ella clipped to the lantern post. Sometimes I talked to it while the light flickered. Every few days, I called the house, hoping to hear their voices. Each time, Kelsey answered. "They're doing well," she'd say. Mason made a new friend. Ella's reading again. Her calmness was worse than anger. She never raised her voice, never slipped, never gave me anything to push against. When I mentioned a custody appeal, she laughed softly and said, "Maybe it's time you focused on yourself." Weeks later, a certified letter arrived at the post office box I'd rented. My severance from the firm had been reduced due to misconduct. The explanation accused me of accessing confidential company files. I read it twice before understanding what it implied. Kelsey had set it up. Without that money, even the storage unit felt uncertain. I sold my wedding ring at a pawn shop for $40 and used half of it to buy gas. The night I returned, the air inside the unit was colder than usual. My flashlight beam drifted over the stacked boxes, then caught on something wedged behind a broken chair, a flash of brown leather. I pulled it free. The handle was cracked, the surface dusty, but the tag was clear. Nora J. Bennett. My knees went weak. I had never owned a briefcase like it. The lock was old-fashioned 3 digits. I tried birthdays, anniversaries, the kids' initials. Nothing worked. I set it aside, wrapped myself in a blanket, and listened to the wind claw at the door. Around 2 a.m, I sat up. "You took everything, Aaron," I whispered into the dark. "Maybe not this." I reached for a screwdriver and forced the latch until it snapped open. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills and a single folded note. The handwriting tilted forward, fast and familiar. "If you're reading this, you've lost everything." Good. "Only when the lies are stripped away can you see the truth." It was signed Uncle Walter. I read it again, tracing the lines with my thumb. "The money inside this case is travel money. The real fortune and the truth about your father's death waits at these coordinates, Timberwolf Trail, Montana." Below it, a faint map reference in fading ink. I stared at it until the lantern dimmed. Uncle Walter had vanished years ago after my father's accident at the mill, the one everyone called a malfunction. He'd been branded paranoid, a man haunted by things he couldn't prove. Now in that metal box of a room, his warning felt less like madness and more like a door I was meant to open. I counted the money twice, $49,000, banded and stamped by a local bank. Not stolen, not counterfeit. Real. I paced the narrow floor until dawn, the letter trembling in my hand. What did he mean by fortune? Was it money or something else entirely? When the first light spilled through the slats of the door, I made my choice. I would leave Oregon behind. Whatever waited at Timberwolf Trail had already been waiting too long. I packed a duffel bag with clothes, a flashlight, and a paper map. I sold the last pieces of jewelry I had left and bought an old Ford Escape from a man who didn't ask questions. When I caught my reflection in the window, I barely knew the woman staring back, pale, hollow-eyed, but still breathing. I slid the briefcase under the passenger seat and whispered, "Goodbye, rock bottom." Then I turned the key and headed east toward the mountains, toward the only thing that still made sense, the truth. The miles unrolled like a long exhale. Oregon's gray skies gave way to open plains and snow-dust roads. Gas station coffee became my breakfast. Silence became my company. Every bump in the highway made the briefcase rattle, as if it were alive, urging me forward. Somewhere beyond those miles, my father's story waited. And whatever I found there, it would be something that belonged only to me. The drive from Oregon to Montana stretched like a single long thought I couldn't finish. The miles blurred together, pine forests, thin fog, and stretches of empty highway where even the radio signal died. Every few hours I stopped for gas or coffee and checked that the briefcase was still under the seat. The rattle of its latch became a strange comfort, a steady reminder that I wasn't entirely lost. Each night I slept in small motels or roadside lots, watching snow creep down the mountains. By the third day, the air grew thinner and colder, and the land looked older, as if the trees had been standing guard over secrets for 100 years. When my GPS lost signal just past Flathead County, I knew I was close. The coordinates from my uncle's letter pointed to a narrow road that looked more like a scar in the snow, Timberwolf Trail. A metal gate leaned crooked on its hinges, with a faded private property sign barely hanging. I parked and stepped out the cold, biting through my jacket. Under the gate, half buried in ice, I found a small key taped to a beam, the same kind of key that had been fastened under the briefcase handle. My hands shook as I slid it into the padlock. It turned easily. The sound of metal scraping open echoed through the stillness, a sound so sharp it startled a flock of birds from the trees. The path wound uphill through dense forest, and soon the snow reached my knees. The world had gone completely silent. No cars, no wind, just my breath fogging in the air. Then I saw it, a massive boulder shaped like a bear's head, exactly as the note described. Behind it stood a cabin, not an old hunter's shack, but a solid, well-built structure with metal shutters and solar panels on the roof. A generator hummed faintly beside the porch. I hesitated at the door, expecting it to resist, but when I tried the handle, it opened without a sound, as if it had been waiting. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and cedar. I turned on my flashlight and froze. The walls were covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connected by red string. It looked like the inside of a detective's mind, faces, dates, arrows drawn between names I half recognized. At the center of one wall hung a large photograph of my father, James Bennett, shaking hands with another man in front of the sawmill. The caption beneath it, written in my uncle's sharp handwriting, read, "Partnership Agreement, 1987, James Bennett and Patrick Whitfield." My heart clenched. Aaron's father. I moved closer, following a string that stretched from that photo to a stack of documents pinned nearby. Maintenance logs, insurance claims, and police reports. The same date appeared again and again the day my father died. He'd been crushed by a malfunctioning loader. The reports described it as an accident, but my uncle's notes told another story. Safety system tampered. Loader serviced 24 hours prior. Insurance policy increased 3 months earlier. Beneath those lines, another note. They killed him for the mineral rights. I sank onto a chair beside the desk and covered my mouth with my hands. For a long time, the only sound in the cabin was the slow hum of the generator outside. I flipped through the papers one by one, trying to make sense of the handwriting that looked more frantic with each page. My uncle had pieced together everything: financial transfers, property deeds, and meeting notes linking the Whitfields to my father's business. There were photocopies of bank statements showing payments to local inspectors and attorneys. It wasn't just business rivalry. It was theft and cover-up. When I turned toward another wall, I noticed a section labeled K. Bennett. My stomach tightened. There were photos of Kelsey at different ages, 17, 20, 30. In one, she was standing outside a cafe beside Patrick Whitfield. In another, she was signing a check from Whitfield Industries. Tucked among the photos was a small tape recorder. The label said Riverside Motel 2012. My hand trembled as I pressed play. Static filled the cabin, followed by Kelsey's voice, clear and young. "She trusts me completely," she said. Then a man's deeper voice answered, smooth and measured. "Good. Once she's out of the picture, Aaron inherits through the marriage, and we secure the rights through the kids. Keep her close, keep her quiet." The recorder slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. The sound startled me, but I couldn't move. I stared at the ceiling, trying to process what I had just heard. My sister hadn't stumbled into an affair. She had been part of a plan, something built long before I ever saw that photo in my inbox. My father's death, my job, my marriage, they weren't random misfortunes. They were pieces of a puzzle that had been arranged years ago. On the desk, an envelope lay under a paperweight marked, "For Nora only." Inside was a copy of Uncle Walter's will. My name appeared again and again in neat, typed paragraphs. He had left me everything: his accounts, the land, and something else. Ownership of the Bennett mineral rights, estimated value $80 million. My breath caught. I turned the pages, barely able to focus. At the bottom in his handwriting was a note. "When the lies are stripped away, you'll see who the wolves really are." The snow outside deepened as the wind began to rise. I stood by the window looking out at the endless white and realized my uncle had lived here alone for decades to guard this truth. Every accusation about his paranoia had been a defense against the same people who'd destroyed my family. On another table sat several boxes labeled evidence. Inside were ledgers, payment receipts, and flash drives. One folder held emails between Aaron and Kelsey, dated months before I had ever suspected anything. The proof was everywhere. I sat down again, shaking. A small envelope was taped to the underside of the desk. The words written across it made my throat close. Your choice defines everything. Inside were two things, a USB drive and a single-page letter. Nora, it read, I couldn't save your father, but you can save yourself. This drive holds every record of what they did enough to bring them down. You can take the money and disappear, or you can finish what I started. But the truth will cost you peace before it sets you free. I held the USB between my palms. It felt small and ordinary, nothing like the weight it carried. Outside, the snowstorm eased, and the last of the daylight faded behind the trees. My father's face stared back at me from the wall, frozen in that handshake with Patrick Whitfield, a man who had destroyed 2 generations of my family. I thought about Mason and Ella, about the stories Aaron would tell them if I stayed silent. The air inside the cabin felt thick, almost alive, as if the place itself was waiting for my answer. I stayed there for hours sorting through papers until dawn. The evidence was undeniable, dozens of signatures, hidden transfers, and letters connecting the Whitfields to every step of the cover-up. When the first light crept through the blinds, I packed everything into a duffel bag, the files, the tapes, the USB. I closed the door behind me and turned the key in the lock one last time. The wind had stopped, and the snow glittered under a pale pink sky. At the end of the path, I saw a pickup truck parked near the gate. A man stepped out wearing a ranger's jacket and gloves. You lost? He asked, squinting against the morning sun. His name tag read C. Warner. Not anymore, I said quietly. He nodded toward the trail. That old place up there, it belonged to Walter Harlan, right? Folks around here said he kept to himself. Strange man, but sharp. I forced a smile. He was my uncle. The ranger's expression softened. Then you take care, ma'am. Roads get icy past noon. If you need a map, stop by the station down the hill. I will, I said, though I already knew I wouldn't. When I climbed into my car, the briefcase sat on the passenger seat beside the duffel. I started the engine, letting the heater fight the cold air. The USB drive rested in my hand for a long moment before I slid it into my pocket. Somewhere ahead, a phone call waited, the one that would change everything again. As I pulled away from Timberwolf Trail, the cabin disappeared behind a wall of white trees. The truth wasn't finished yet. It had only begun to wake. The snow carried me out of Timberwolf Trail like a quiet tide, the road twisting through forest until the pines thinned and the land opened into gray fields. I drove until the gas gauge blinked and stopped at a small-town station with one pump and a dog sleeping beside the door. The air smelled of fuel and wet earth. I filled the tank, bought coffee, and sat behind the wheel until the warmth seeped back into my fingers. The USB drive rested on the seat beside me, so small that it seemed impossible it could hold the weight of everything I had learned inside that cabin. By late afternoon, I reached the nearest motel, a narrow strip of rooms behind a diner, the kind built decades ago when the highway still mattered. The sign flickered vacancy in half-lit red. Inside, the clerk wore a cardigan and glasses hanging from a chain. Her name tag said Linda. "Storm coming again?" she said, sliding a key across the counter. "You'll want extra blankets." I thanked her, and she handed me an old thermos from behind the desk. "Coffee's on the house. Nobody should drive through what's headed this way." Her kindness hit harder than she could know. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. I set the duffel on the table, laid out the papers, and stared at the USB. My uncle's letter echoed in my head. "You can take the money and disappear, or you can finish what I started." I had the cash to vanish, to rebuild quietly somewhere far from everyone who'd hurt me. But the thought of my children made that impossible. Mason still believed his father's version of the story. Ella was too young to understand why her mother had vanished from their lives. If I ran, the truth would die with me, and their future would still belong to people who destroyed everything before them. I plugged the drive into my old laptop and held my breath. Folders filled the screen labeled Contracts, Deposits, Audio, and one marked Insurance Fraud. Each opened into hundreds of documents, scans of legal papers, voice memos, and photos. One file showed an email chain between Patrick Whitfield and 2 local officials arranging a safety inspection review. Another contained spreadsheets linking the mill's mineral rights to offshore accounts. My uncle had been right about everything. Every lie that built the Whitfield empire was sitting in front of me waiting for light. At some point, the snow began again tapping against the window. I worked through the night cataloging what I could, taking notes until the words blurred. Just before dawn, there was a knock at the door. I froze, heart pounding, but it was only Linda with a tray of oatmeal and fruit. "You looked too tired last night," she said, setting it down. "Eat something before you get back on the road." I didn't correct her. "Thank you," I managed. Her kindness steadied me. After she left, I opened my phone and scrolled to the number I hadn't called in years, the FBI field office in Seattle. When a calm voice answered, I asked for someone who handled corporate or financial crimes. The woman paused, then transferred me. A moment later, another voice came through. "Agent Keller," she said, "how can I help you?" It took everything I had not to hang up. "My name is Nora Bennett," I said, staring at the stacks of papers around me. "I have evidence of a 30-year cover-up involving the Whitfield family. It includes murder insurance fraud and property theft." The line stayed silent long enough for me to think she'd disconnected. Then Agent Keller spoke low and even. "Ms. Bennett, I'm listening." We talked for nearly an hour. She asked where I was, what kind of evidence I had, whether anyone else knew I'd found it. I told her about the USB drive, the recordings, and the files linking Patrick Whitfield to my father's death. When I finished, she exhaled quietly. "This is serious material," she said. "I'll need to verify what you have." "Can you meet with me in person?" I agreed. She gave me a time and address in Seattle for the following morning. "One more thing," she added. "Don't contact anyone connected to this until we talk. Not your ex-husband, not your sister, no one. Understand?" "I understand," I said. "Good. Keep the originals with you. We'll make copies when you arrive." The next morning, the sky cleared into a brittle blue. I checked out of the motel and thanked Linda, who slipped a paper sack into my hand. "Muffins," she said, "in case you forget to eat again." I smiled. "You're too kind." She waved me off with a wink. The drive to Seattle took most of the day. The city skyline appeared through a curtain of rain, familiar yet distant, like a place that belonged to someone I used to be. I parked outside the address Agent Keller had given me, an unmarked building near the waterfront, and walked inside clutching the duffel. Agent Diane Keller looked exactly how her voice sounded, composed, steady, a kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise itself. She shook my hand and guided me into a small conference room. "You've had quite a trip," she said. I nodded and placed the briefcase on the table. "Everything's in here." She opened it carefully, scanning a few pages. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "You weren't exaggerating," she said. "Let's make digital copies before anyone realizes this material's in play." Over the next several hours, she and a young analyst worked in silence while I sat in the corner drinking coffee that had gone cold. They photographed documents, transferred files, and whispered over details I couldn't follow. When they finished, Diane closed her folder. "We'll start with financial tracing," she said. "Some of these accounts go back decades, but we can work backward from the mill's closure and the mineral leases. I'll need you to stay reachable, but out of sight." She handed me a prepaid phone. "Use this number only. We'll contact you when we've verified enough to move." The next 5 months passed like a long, slow echo. I rented a small room above a bakery outside the city, paid in cash, and lived quietly. Each week, Diane called with small updates. "We've confirmed transfers through 3 shell companies," she'd say. Or, "We've subpoenaed insurance records from 1987. Her voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the growing weight in her tone. One night, after another restless sleep, my phone buzzed before dawn. "It's happening," Diane said. "Stay where you are. Turn on the news." The screen filled with flashing lights and camera crews. Agents led Aaron out of a country club in handcuffs. Behind him, Patrick Whitfield stumbled as cameras shouted his name. Kelsey was last head-bowed, coat over her face, as she was escorted to a black SUV. The crawl at the bottom of the screen read, "FBI raids Whitfield Industries in $80 million fraud and murder cover-up investigation." I sat on the bed, the phone still pressed to my ear. Diane's voice was soft but firm. "You did the right thing, Ms. Bennett." The words didn't feel triumphant. They felt heavy, like a bell ringing at the end of a long storm. Outside the window, the morning light reached over the rooftops slow and gold. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. The truth had left the shadows, and it wasn't mine to carry alone anymore. I turned off the television and closed my eyes. Tomorrow there would be courtrooms and statements, questions I wasn't ready to answer. But for now, there was silence, steady, clean, and earned, the kind that comes right before the next chapter begins. The morning after the arrests, Seattle buzzed like a hive. Reporters crowded courthouse steps, every station, looping the same footage: Aaron in cuffs, Kelsey shielding her face, Patrick Whitfield, pale and defiant. I watched from a quiet apartment over the bakery blinds, drawn coffee untouched. My phone vibrated until I finally answered. It was Agent Keller. "It's time," she said. "They'll call you as a witness. You need to be ready." 3 days later, I sat in a federal office across from Keller and a man she introduced as Martin Reese, the prosecutor assigned to the case. He was steady, methodical, the kind of person who chose each word like a stone in a foundation. A stack of binders sat between us. "Your testimony ties the financial trail to motive," he explained, flipping open one folder. "The jury needs to understand what these records meant to you, what they cost your family." I nodded, still trying to steady my voice. "You'll have protection during proceedings," Keller added. "The defendants have limited contact. Focus on the truth." In the weeks that followed, I prepared for trial the way I used to prepare for a design review, careful, detailed rehearsing answers until I could say them without shaking. Keller walked me through the exhibits, the forged contracts, the insurance files, and the recording from that motel. When Kelsey's voice echoed from the speakers, "She trusts me completely," the room seemed to tilt. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for disbelief. By the time spring touched the city, the trial began. The courthouse was packed with journalists, photographers, and faces I didn't recognize. The air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. I took my seat in the witness room, hands folded in my lap, while outside voices hummed like distant thunder. Keller entered a calm anchor amid the noise. "Remember," she said, resting a hand on my shoulder, "you're not here to defend yourself. You're here to tell what happened." When my name was called, I walked to the stand, the wood railing cool beneath my fingers. The oath echoed in my ears. Across the room, Aaron sat at the defense table in a dark suit that looked borrowed, eyes downcast. Kelsey was beside him, her wrists trembling slightly, mascara smudged like smoke. Patrick's seat remained empty. He had died weeks before the trial began, his empire collapsing with him. The prosecutor's questions came steady and clear. "State your name, Nora Bennett, and your relationship to the defendants. Aaron Whitfield was my husband." "Kelsey Bennett is my sister." He nodded. "Tell the court what led you here today." I told them everything: the email, the affair, the firing, the lies in court. I described the storage unit, the briefcase, and the letter from my uncle that sent me north to Montana. I walked them through the cabin, the wall of photographs, the recordings, and the evidence that tied my father's death to the Whitfield's fortune. My voice wavered only once when they played the tape of Kelsey and Patrick plotting. The sound filled the courtroom, a sharp echo of betrayal that no distance could dull. Someone gasped in the back row. Kelsey covered her face with both hands. Aaron stared straight ahead, jaw tight, pretending not to hear. When the defense took their turn, Aaron's lawyer tried to shift the story. "Ms. Bennett," he said smoothly, "is it true that after your divorce you lived in a storage unit?" "Yes," I answered, "because your client left me with nothing." He smiled thinly. "Would you say you were emotionally unstable during that period?" "I would say," I replied, steady, "that your client underestimated what happens when the truth finally finds light." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge tapped his gavel for order, but something had shifted. From that moment, the defense never regained their footing. Over 4 days, witnesses testified: bank clerks, contractors, and investigators who traced the money trail Walter had begun years before. Each detail built the case, altered ledgers, hidden accounts, and falsified safety reports from the mill. The puzzle came together piece by piece until there was no denying what had been done. When the verdict came, the courtroom was still. Aaron Whitfield, 18 years for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Kelsey Bennett, 12 years for perjury and aiding in the cover-up. Patrick Whitfield Sr. charges dismissed due to death before sentencing, but his estate frozen pending civil action. The gavel struck once final and heavy. The room exhaled. I didn't cheer and I didn't cry. I just felt something release, a slow unwinding inside my chest. Afterward, Keller found me in the hallway. "You did it," she said quietly. I shook my head. "No. My uncle did." She smiled. "Maybe. But you finished it." A few days later, I received a request I hadn't expected. Kelsey wanted to see me before transfer. Keller hesitated. "You don't owe her that," she said. I know I answered, but I need to hear it once. The visit took place in a small holding room divided by glass. Kelsey looked smaller than I remembered, her hair tied back, her eyes red-rimmed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "You were never supposed to find out." I folded my hands on the counter. "You always said I was too trusting. Guess I learned." She nodded, tears sliding down her face. "Aaron said we'd be rich. He said he loved me." Her voice cracked. "He said the same thing to me once." Kelsey pressed her palm to the glass. "I ruined everything." I stared at her, the sister I'd once shared secrets with in a bunk bed under glow-in-the-dark stars. "You could have told me," I said softly. "You were my family." She broke down, shoulders shaking, and for the first time I almost pitied her. But pity wasn't forgiveness. When the guard signaled time, she looked up again. "What happens now?" she asked. I stood. "Now we both live with what we've done," I said. "The difference is, I'll use it for something good." Outside, the sky was pale gray snow beginning to fall again. The courthouse steps were nearly empty. I tilted my head back and let the flakes touch my face. They melted fast against my skin, sharp and cold. For the first time in years, I wasn't running or hiding. Justice quiet and unadorned had finally arrived. I walked toward the parking lot, the city muffled in soft white. Ahead of me, the road was clear. What waited next wasn't revenge, it was rebuilding. I just didn't yet know what that life would look like or how much light it could still hold. But the air felt different now, clean and new. I started the car and watched the snow gather on the windshield, ready to see where the road would lead. After the sentencing, the world felt quieter in ways I couldn't name. Months passed before I stopped waking to the sound of doors slamming in dreams. I sold my car, closed the storage unit, and started looking for a place that didn't carry ghosts. The estate funds had finally cleared Walter's land accounts and mineral rights, all transferred into my name after decades of being hidden. When the final paperwork arrived, the number startled me, $80 million. It didn't feel real. Not like wealth, more like the burden of every name written in those files. I met Evelyn Torres through a friend of Agent Keller's. She wore red-framed glasses and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd seen every kind of buyer. "You don't strike me as someone chasing marble floors," she said when we met. She was right. I wanted space quiet, something alive, but simple. Within 2 weeks, she founded a white farmhouse on the edge of Portland paint, weathered shutters uneven, a porch that leaned slightly, as if bowing to the wind. The price barely registered. What mattered was how it felt when I stepped inside. The floors creaked softly, and sunlight fell through the windows like forgiveness. "It's not perfect," Evelyn warned. "Neither am I," I said, signing the offer. The first few weeks were a rhythm of small repairs and long silences. I painted the kitchen yellow, planted daisies along the fence, and replaced the porch swing with one like the one Aaron and I once built. Except this time it was mine alone. Each nail, each brushstroke steadied something in me. When the mornings came, I made coffee and sat outside watching fog lift off the fields, a soundscape of birds and the distant hum of tractors replacing sirens and voices that used to haunt my thoughts. Keller visited once, bringing a manila envelope of final documents. "It's officially closed," she said. "All of it." I asked how the others were handling their sentences. Aaron's appealing, though it won't change the outcome. Kelsey's kept quiet. I nodded, unsure if relief or sadness sat heavier in my chest. Before she left, Keller looked at the farmhouse, then back at me. "Walter would have liked this place," she said. "He believed in starting over." I spent that evening going through the last of his letters, old notebooks filled with scribbles about justice memory, and something he called the long game of truth. On one page, he'd written, "We are born into silence, but we choose whether it keeps us or frees us." I copied that line on a scrap of paper and taped it inside my kitchen cabinet next to the teacups. A month later, I registered the Harlan Hope Fund, a foundation named for him dedicated to helping women rebuild after financial or emotional collapse. The first grants went to local shelters, therapy programs, and a housing nonprofit that helped single mothers transition from hardship. Each application I read brought me back to that cold night in the storage unit, to the woman who thought her story was already over. By summer, life had started to find its shape again. Mason and Ella began visiting on weekends. At first, they stood uncertain at the gate, clutching backpacks and glancing toward the house like it might bite. I met them halfway down the gravel drive. "You can always come home to me," I said quietly. Ella was the first to move. She dropped her bag and wrapped her arms around me, face pressed against my shoulder. Mason followed slower, but sure. He didn't say much that day, but his eyes softened when he looked around the yard. We spent that weekend baking cookies, the kitchen filled with flour and laughter that sounded almost new. At night, Ella fell asleep on the couch with her stuffed bunny tucked under her chin, and Mason stayed up watching old movies with me, both of us, too careful to admit how much we'd missed this. Before going to bed, he paused in the hallway. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'm proud of you." The words hit harder than any verdict could. I stood there long after he'd gone upstairs, the house finally feeling full again. The foundation grew slowly, one story at a time. Women wrote from places I'd never been, Detroit, Amarillo, Spokane, sharing fragments of what they'd lost and what they were trying to rebuild. We helped them find lawyers housing small business grants. Sometimes they sent photos months later, a new apartment key, a graduation gown, a child's drawing taped to a wall that was finally theirs. Each one reminded me why the truth had to hurt first to make space for something cleaner to grow. In late autumn, a letter arrived from the prison. I recognized Kelsey's handwriting instantly. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. Her words were short, almost cautious. "I think about what I did every day. I don't expect forgiveness, but if you ever decide to visit, I'll be here." There was no apology, just a quiet acknowledgement of ruin. I placed the letter in a drawer with the others, not out of anger, but because some endings need more time to settle before they can be faced. By December, the farmhouse had become a haven not just for me, but for others. Volunteers from the foundation came on weekends to plan fundraisers around my long kitchen table. Evelyn stopped by, often bringing fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Even Keller visited again, this time off duty, sitting by the fire with tea and stories that made her laugh. The porch lights glowed against the early dark, and for the first time in years, the sound of laughter didn't feel like something borrowed. Sometimes, late at night, I'd drive past the old storage facility. My old Unit 42B was still there. The manager said it had been empty for months. I still paid the fee each month, not out of need, but remembrance. That narrow space was where the old version of me died and the new one began. I stood there once more, leaning against the cold metal door, whispering, "Thank you." The road back home felt longer on the return, but the sky was clear, the stars sharp against the dark. When I pulled into the driveway, frost sparkled on the grass, and the porch light spilled across the steps like a welcome. Inside, the heater clicked on, and I could hear Ella's soft snore from her room. Mason's door cracked open with music playing low. I set my keys on the counter, took a deep breath, and felt something settle deep inside me, a peace so quiet it almost felt like gratitude. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Outside, the horizon blushed gold, and the fields shimmered with dew. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stepped onto the porch with my coffee, the air crisp and still. The world felt clean again, unfinished in the best way. Somewhere behind me, the house creaked like it was breathing, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. The truth had burned away nearly everything I thought I needed, but what remained was mine to keep. By the following spring, the farmhouse no longer felt like a stranger's house. It smelled of coffee and sawdust, the air filled with the soft rhythm of daily life. Mason had taken over the spare room, his football gear piled in the corner, and Ella had painted the attic walls with constellations that glowed faintly at night. Some days still carried silence, the kind that reminded me what it took to get here, but it was a gentler quiet now, the kind that waits, not hides. The Harlan Hope Fund had grown faster than I'd expected. We had volunteers in 3 states, and a board that included 2 women who'd once written to me for help. Evelyn handled most of the logistics, her calm voice anchoring every meeting, and Keller stopped by whenever she could, insisting she only came for the cookies Ella baked. Each time she'd find a reason to ask if I'd been sleeping enough, or if I needed an extra security system, and I'd laugh her off. The truth was, I'd started to breathe again. The worst was behind us, or so I thought. One Friday afternoon, an envelope arrived with a federal seal. My first thought was taxes, maybe leftover estate filings. But inside was a court notice, State of Washington versus Whitfield Estate Civil Recovery Hearing. They were calling me as a beneficiary witness. The date was set for June. My pulse quickened even as I read the rest of the letter. Patrick Whitfield's estate was being dismantled, and part of the restitution owed to the victims would come through assets traced back to the mill, the same property that once belonged to my father, the same land he had died protecting. That night I sat on the porch with the letter folded in my lap. Mason joined me barefoot, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "You're thinking too loud," he said, handing me one. I smiled faintly. "Just paperwork." He studied my face. "You still have that look you get when you're about to fix something that isn't yours to fix." He didn't mean it as a joke, but it made me laugh anyway. "You sound just like your uncle," I said. "Guess I'm in good company." The hearing took place in a tall, sterile building that smelled of waxed floors and stale air conditioning. Reese met me in the hallway, a thick folder under his arm. "Most of this is procedural," he said. "You won't have to speak much. The state's reclaiming property that was never lawfully transferred. You're just confirming lineage." I nodded. "Will they be there?" "No," he said gently. "Only lawyers." Inside the room was filled with paperwork and quiet. A judge read through decades of transactions, each one a small echo of the lies that had built the Whitfield name. When she finally reached the final transfer, the mineral rights restored to my family name, her voice softened. "The Bennett estate is hereby recognized as rightful owner." The gavel came down like a heartbeat, solid and final. Reese turned to me with a small smile. "Your father would be proud," he said. For the first time, those words didn't feel like they belonged to someone else's story. They were mine. After the hearing, I drove back toward the mountains, following the same route I'd taken months earlier when I first found Walter's cabin. The snow was gone now, replaced by tall grass and the shimmer of early summer. At the old red gate, I stopped the car and got out. The hinges creaked the same way they had that day. I walked the half-mile up the trail until the cabin came into view, sunlight pooling against its tin roof. Inside, dust coated everything, but the air still held that faint scent of cedar and oil. The photographs on the wall hadn't faded yet. My father, younger and smiling. Walter's notes pinned in neat lines across the boards. I ran a hand over the desk, where the envelope had once sat, the words, "Your choice defines everything," still burned into memory. I didn't stay long, just long enough to know that the ghosts here had finally settled. Before leaving, I locked the door, slipped the key into my pocket and whispered, "Thank you." When I returned home, the sun was setting behind the fields, painting the sky in amber and rose. Evelyn was on the porch sorting envelopes. "You're just in time," she said, holding one out. "We got approval for the new shelter grant." I smiled, tucking the cabin key onto the table beside her. "Then let's get to work." By late summer, the foundation opened its first physical center, a renovated community hall downtown, painted soft blue, filled with donated furniture and shelves of donated books. We named it the Lantern House. On opening day, people drifted in quietly, unsure whether they belonged. I greeted them one by one, remembering every night I'd once spent invisible in that metal box behind the diner. Mason handed out cookies. Ella arranged small potted plants near the windows. Keller showed up with flowers and a camera crew from the local paper, pretending it wasn't her idea. That evening, as the last guest left, I stood outside under the porch light watching the building glow. The sign above the door caught the light, the words Hartman and Harlan Foundation shining softly. It was more than a name, it was a promise kept. Walter's name beside my father's, both finally where they belonged. Life moved on in quiet circles after that. Some mornings I'd still wake before dawn and sit by the window watching fog drift across the pasture. I'd think of the years when I believed silence was safety, when I mistook endurance for peace. Now I understood what Walter meant when he wrote about the long game of truth. It wasn't revenge, it was persistence, the slow work of rebuilding something honest out of what had been taken. One night, Keller stopped by unexpectedly, coat damp from rain. "You're being nominated for a Community Leadership Award," she said, grinning. "Don't look at me like that. It's already approved." I laughed. "I don't do this for trophies." "Good," she said. "That's why you deserve one." After she left, I stood on the porch for a long time listening to the rain. The porch swing creaked softly, the same rhythm I'd built into its chains months ago. Inside the house glowed with warm light, Mason's laughter from the living room, Ella humming, while she brushed paint across another canvas. Everything around me felt steady, unforced. The kind of ordinary that once seemed impossible. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who slept on a cot in a storage unit, who believed her story had ended there. If I could reach back through time, I'd tell her this: the truth will cost you peace before it gives you freedom. But freedom, once earned, changes everything. That night I opened the window and let the rain-scented air roll in. Somewhere beyond the fields, thunder rumbled softly. Tomorrow would come like it always did, and I'd be ready. I didn't know it yet, but a letter was already on its way, a final one from the attorney handling Walter's estate. Inside it waited something I hadn't expected at all, a key and a map that would lead me to one more piece of the past. The last chapter wasn't finished yet. The letter arrived on a mild autumn morning, tucked among the usual bills and catalogs. The envelope was cream-colored, stamped from a law office in Montana. Inside was a short note and a small brass key. The note read, "Final settlement property inventory enclosed. One remaining structure belonging to Walter Harlan, registered posthumously to Nora Bennett. Coordinates attached." I traced the map with my finger and felt that familiar ache of curiosity return, the same one that had led me to Timberwolf Trail the first time. A week later, I made the drive north again, following long roads framed by gold fields and dark evergreens. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, the first sign that winter wasn't far away. The coordinates led to a quiet stretch of land near the edge of Glacier National Park. There, hidden behind a stand of aspens, stood a small shed built from old timber. Its door was locked, but the brass key fit perfectly. Inside, the air was still and dry. Dust floated through the sunlight in slow spirals. Against one wall stood a workbench covered in tools, a rusted lantern, and a wooden box with my name burned into the lid. I lifted the latch. Inside were a handful of old letters, a small stack of photographs, and a pocket knife engraved with my father's initials. Beneath them, a note written in Walter's steady, looping hand. "Nora, this is where the trail ends. Truth is heavy, but it's meant to be carried only long enough to pass it on. You've done that. Let the rest belong to peace." I sat on the workbench for a long while, listening to the soft creak of the cabin settling. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper I could almost understand. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the losses, the lies, the silence that once swallowed every good thing I had. None of it felt like punishment anymore. It felt like proof. Proof that truth, however buried, can still find its way to light. Before leaving, I locked the door again and left the key under the step, just as Walter might have done. On the drive home, the mountains faded in the mirror, their peaks catching the last orange light of sunset. The road curved through valleys I barely recognized, but for the first time I didn't feel like I was retracing old pain. I was returning home lighter than before. Back at the farmhouse, the evening was already soft with twilight. Ella's laughter drifted through an open window, and Mason's music hummed faintly from upstairs. The porch light flickered on as I walked up the steps, and the smell of something sweet, probably Evelyn's apple pie, met me at the door. The life I'd built here was simple, imperfect, but honest. Every board, every choice carried a piece of the strength that once felt out of reach. That night, after the dishes were washed and the kids were asleep, I stepped outside with a blanket and sat on the porch swing. The fields glowed silver under the moonlight, the same land that had once been stolen and now finally was ours again. I could almost see my father in that stillness, could almost hear Walter's laugh drifting across the wind. In the distance, a train horn echoed a long, low note, fading into the dark. It reminded me that life keeps moving, even after everything changes. Maybe that was the lesson hidden inside all of this, that survival isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about learning to live with it in quieter ways. I watched the stars appear one by one and felt a peace settle over me, steady and sure. The past no longer held me hostage. It had become part of the story that built this home, this family, this freedom. So when people ask how I found my way back after losing everything, I tell them, this truth is never kind at first. It takes from you, strips you bare, and demands you rebuild from the ground up. But what grows in its place, honesty, strength, self-respect, those are the things no one can ever take again. If you've listened this far, I hope my story reminds you that even the worst endings can become beginnings if you stay brave enough to keep walking. And if you know someone who needs that reminder too, share this with them. Maybe it's the light they've been waiting for.